The airport buzzed with life. Announcements crackled overhead. Suitcases rolled across polished floors, and travelers rushed to their gates. But amid the chaos, one moment changed everything. A sharp slap echoed through the boarding area. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. And there, standing at the gate, was Eleanor Grace Lancaster, a refined black woman in her 70s, gripping her cane as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The flight attendant before her, Madison Clark, a young, sharp-featured woman in a crisp uniform, looked down at her with thinly veiled disdain. The way Madison's lips curled, the way her fingers still lingered in the air from where they had struck, told the entire story. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. This was about power. Grace didn't stumble. She didn't shout. She simply straightened her shoulders, adjusted her pearl necklace, and met Madison's eyes with quiet fire. And then, in a voice that sent a chill through the air, she said 6 words. "You just made the worst mistake." The passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging uneasy glances. No one spoke up. No one dared to intervene. But what they didn't know, what Madison had failed to realize, was that Grace Lancaster was no ordinary passenger. This flight wasn't just another journey. It was about to become a reckoning. What would you do if you witnessed this? Was this just a rude flight attendant or something far worse? Let us know in the comments. Also, tell us where you're watching from, and if you think Madison will regret her actions. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because trust me, this is only the beginning. You won't believe what happens next. Grace Lancaster moved carefully through the terminal, her hands steadying on the handle of her leather purse as she walked with measured steps. The hum of the airport was a familiar sound, a backdrop to the decades she had spent traveling. The weight of years rested on her joints, but not on her spirit. At 82, she had seen enough of life to recognize cruelty before it even had the chance to take form. She just hadn't expected it to come from the woman standing at the entrance to the first-class boarding line. Madison Clark had been a flight attendant for years, long enough to believe that she knew exactly who belonged in first class and who didn't. Tall, with sleek blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform crisp and unwrinkled, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who thought she owned the cabin. She barely glanced at most passengers as they passed, offering automatic smiles to those who looked the part. Businessmen in expensive suits, polished women with designer handbags. But when her gaze landed on Grace, something flickered in her expression, a quick assessment that settled into mild amusement. She leaned slightly toward her colleague, a younger attendant named Emma, and smirked. "Check this out," she murmured. "I think we've got a lost soul wandering into the wrong part of the airport." Emma, still new enough to the job to hesitate, glanced over at Grace and frowned. "She has a ticket, doesn't she?" Madison rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. Look at her. She can barely walk straight. Either she got confused or someone's about to be very disappointed when she tries to take their seat." As Grace approached, Madison's smirk widened. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked, her voice overly sweet, the kind of condescending tone reserved for children or those she deemed too feeble-minded to function properly. Grace, unfazed, reached into her purse with fingers that trembled slightly from age. She pulled out her neatly folded ticket and held it out. Madison didn't even take it at first. Instead, she let out a soft chuckle and shook her head. "Oh, sweetheart," she said just loud enough for the passengers around them to hear. "I think you might be a little confused. This is the first-class line." Grace's expression remained impassive. "I know," she said simply. Madison finally took the ticket, glancing at it with an exaggerated sigh. As her eyes scanned the details, her smile faltered for a brief second before returning with forced politeness. The ticket was real. The seat was real. But that didn't make sense to her. "Are you sure this is yours?" Madison asked, tilting her head. "I mean, it's just, these seats are quite expensive." There it was. The doubt. The quiet, poisonous suggestion that someone like Grace couldn't possibly afford such luxury. A few passengers in line shifted, sensing the tension but saying nothing. Others smirked, entertained by the unfolding scene. Grace met Madison's gaze with unwavering calm. "I don't believe I carry tickets that don't belong to me." The response, so measured and unaffected, irritated Madison more than she expected. She didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who should have been grateful she was even being spoken to at all. She tapped the ticket against her palm, then suddenly turned toward Emma. "Can you check the system? I just want to be sure there's no mistake." Emma hesitated but nodded, walking a few steps away to pull up the flight manifest. Madison turned back to Grace and sighed dramatically. "You know," she said, her voice still coated in fake sweetness, "I think it's great when older folks like you travel. Keeps the spirit young, doesn't it?" Grace said nothing. Madison smiled wider. "I just hope you don't have any trouble getting around. These seats are meant for people who can actually well manage them." A soft chuckle rippled through the line. Grace's fingers tightened slightly on her purse, but she remained composed. "I assure you I manage quite well." Madison didn't look convinced. She handed the ticket back, but didn't move aside. "Well," she said, "let's just wait for confirmation, shall we? Wouldn't want to send you all the way down to first class only to have to walk you back." A few passengers whispered. Grace stood her ground. Emma returned, clearing her throat. "The ticket's valid," she said quietly. Madison's expression didn't change, but something darkened in her eyes. She stepped aside, her tone clipped. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am." Grace walked past her without another word, moving toward the jet bridge with quiet dignity. But Madison wasn't done. She turned back to Emma, her lips curling slightly. "She's going to be a problem," she muttered. "I can feel it." Emma said nothing. She wasn't sure what was worse, the cruelty in Madison's words or the fact that so many people had just witnessed it and said nothing at all. Grace walked down the jet bridge at a steady but unhurried pace. Her cane tapped lightly against the floor, her grip firm but not desperate. She had traveled her whole life, always moving forward, always in control. But today, that control felt fragile, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. The moment she stepped onto the plane, she felt it, the weight of judgment pressing down on her like thick humidity before a storm. Madison was right behind her, close enough that Grace could feel her breath. "Let's get you settled, sweetheart," Madison cooed, her voice dripping with artificial kindness. Then, without warning, she clapped a hand against Grace's back, hard. Not enough to push her over, but enough to make her stumble. Grace's foot caught slightly, and she had to grip the nearest seat for balance. A sharp pain shot through her knee, but she remained upright. Passengers turned. A few raised eyebrows. One woman gasped softly. Madison let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh no, did I startle you? My bad. You okay, dear?" Grace straightened, ignoring the throbbing in her joints. She nodded, refusing to meet Madison's gaze. "Good, good," Madison continued, too loudly. "Wouldn't want to have to call for medical assistance before we even take off." A few chuckles rippled through the cabin. A businessman in the row ahead of Grace glanced back briefly before returning to his phone, uninterested. Grace pressed her lips together. She wasn't new to this kind of treatment. She had spent her life moving through spaces where people assumed things about her before she even opened her mouth. But knowing didn't make it sting any less. She reached her seat, 2A, a plush leather window seat. She eased herself down, feeling the familiar stiffness in her joints. The relief was brief. Before she could even settle in, Madison swooped in like a bird of prey, gripping the tray table in front of Grace. "Let's make sure everything is in working order," Madison said sweetly. Then, without warning, she jerked the tray table down with force, making it slam against Grace's lap. The impact sent a jolt through her, her breath catching slightly. Her fingers instinctively gripped the armrests. Madison let out a little laugh. "Oops, did that startle you?" she asked innocently. "I forget how jumpy older folks can be. Reflexes aren't what they used to be, huh?" A soft murmur rippled through the rows behind her. Someone snickered. Grace exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the cool leather of the armrest. Madison stepped back, seemingly satisfied with her little performance. "You let me know if you need anything, okay? We wouldn't want you getting overwhelmed." Grace turned her gaze out the window. The sky outside was clear and endless, stretching far beyond this tiny, suffocating space. But Madison wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but ensuring it was loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You know," she mused, tapping her chin, "I should probably let the captain know we have a delicate passenger on board. You know, just in case we need to make an emergency landing." Grace's fingers curled slightly. Madison sighed dramatically. "I mean, we wouldn't want any incidents mid-air. Maybe I should get you a special needs form to fill out?" A couple of passengers chuckled under their breath. A younger flight attendant, Leah, hesitated a few feet away, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Grace said nothing. She didn't move, didn't react, because there was nothing to be done. Madison smiled and turned away, sauntering down the aisle. As she passed Leah, she whispered something in her ear. Whatever it was, Leah's expression darkened. More laughter followed from Madison as she disappeared into the galley. Grace inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had spent decades commanding rooms filled with men who underestimated her. She had built businesses from the ground up. She had raised children and grandchildren to be strong, to never let the world define them. But here, in this narrow aisle, in this moment, she had no power. She was trapped. She turned her gaze back to the window, focusing on the sky. Madison, it was the silence of those around her. Not a single passenger had spoken up. Not one had questioned why a flight attendant treated an elderly woman like an inconvenience rather than a customer. When the scent of food drifted through the cabin, her stomach tightened in protest. She hadn't eaten since early that morning, and the long wait at the airport had drained her energy. Passengers around her began receiving their meals, carefully plated dishes of roasted chicken, pasta, and fresh fruit. Grace sat patiently, hands folded on her lap, waiting her turn. Madison moved down the aisle, her voice artificially sweet as she served each passenger. The man across from Grace received his tray with a warm smile from Madison. The woman behind her was asked if she preferred white or red wine. Yet when Madison finally reached Grace's row, she barely glanced at her. Instead, she leaned over to a well-dressed man in 2B and placed his meal in front of him, smiling. "Enjoy, sir. Let me know if you need anything else." Then she turned, tray still in hand, and walked away. Grace blinked, momentarily unsure if it had been an oversight. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. By now, everyone around her had begun eating. She cleared her throat lightly, trying to catch Madison's attention as she passed by again. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I believe I haven't received my meal." Madison stopped, tilting her head as if confused. "Oh," she said, her voice laced with mock surprise. "Are you sure, dear? Maybe you just forgot you already ate." A few chuckles from nearby passengers made the heat rise in Grace's face. She kept her voice level. "No, I haven't eaten yet." Madison sighed dramatically, shaking her head. All right. No need to get upset." She sauntered off toward the galley, deliberately taking her time. 5 more minutes passed. Then 7. When she finally returned, she dropped the tray onto Grace's table with just a little too much force, making the utensils rattle. "Here you go," she said, rolling her eyes. "But you should be careful. People your age should be eating less anyway. Don't want your heart giving out mid-flight, right?" Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. She refused to react, but her appetite had dimmed. She unwrapped her silverware, ignoring the way Madison hovered nearby, watching. Her hands, steady for most things, trembled slightly when she picked up her fork. Years of arthritis had weakened her joints, made her grip less sure. She had adapted, learned patience, but today her frustration made the shaking worse. The moment her knife slipped slightly against the chicken, Madison gasped loudly, making several passengers turn their heads. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed. "Are you okay? You nearly stabbed yourself." Grace set her utensils down, swallowing the flicker of embarrassment crawling up her spine. "I'm fine," she said. Madison grinned. "I should probably cut that for you," she continued, reaching for the knife. I mean, we don't want an accident. These knives are pretty sharp." She lowered her voice into a stage whisper. "Maybe I should get you something softer. We do have some mashed potatoes in the baby meal section." Laughter rippled around them. A man 2 rows back shook his head, amused. Another passenger snickered under his breath. Grace inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I can manage," she said, keeping her voice even. Madison leaned in, still holding onto the knife. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "It would be a shame if you choked or something." For a fleeting moment, Grace met Madison's gaze head-on. Cold, calculated. This wasn't just playful cruelty anymore. This was something deeper, something Madison enjoyed. The power, the control, the slow chipping away of someone's dignity. Without another word, Madison straightened and walked away, her laughter blending into the hum of conversation. Grace took a slow breath and picked up her fork again, ignoring the tightness in her chest, the burn of humiliation under her skin. She forced herself to eat, each bite tasting like paper. Passengers around her continued their meals, oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. Across the aisle, Leah, the young flight attendant, stood frozen near the galley, her expression unreadable. She had seen everything, but like everyone else, she said nothing. Grace forced herself to chew, swallowing down both the tasteless food and the weight of humiliation pressing against her ribs. The laughter had died down, but the damage lingered in the air, clinging to her skin like a stain. Across the aisle, Madison busied herself with other passengers, flashing bright, professional smiles that masked the venom underneath. But Grace knew it wasn't over. Madison wasn't done. A few minutes later, Madison returned, a tray in hand. "Let's get you something to drink, dear," she said, setting down a full glass of water in front of Grace. Unlike the other passengers, who had received drinks in cups with lids and straws, Grace's was a fragile glass, filled nearly to the brim. No straw, no lid. Grace glanced at it, then at Madison. The message was clear. Madison smiled sweetly. "I would have given you a straw, but I wasn't sure if you could manage it. Sometimes people your age forget how to use them." A few soft chuckles from nearby seats. Grace ignored them. She reached out, her fingers closing around the cool glass. Her grip was steady at first, but arthritis made simple things harder. As she lifted it, the water sloshed slightly, the weight uneven in her grasp. Madison's eyes gleamed. The glass slipped slightly in her hand, just enough for a small splash of water to spill onto the tray table. The moment it happened, Madison gasped dramatically, stepping back as if Grace had upended the entire cup. "Oh dear," she exclaimed loudly, drawing more attention from the surrounding passengers. "We should be careful. At your age, even a little spill could lead to, well, a bigger accident." Laughter rippled through the rows. A businessman across the aisle smirked, shaking his head. A younger woman pretended not to notice, but pressed her lips together. Grace calmly set the glass down, dabbing at the spill with her napkin. But Madison wasn't finished. She pulled a pack of baby wipes from her cart and placed it on Grace's tray table with exaggerated care. "Here," she cooed. "This might be easier for you than regular napkins. And don't worry, dear. No one's judging." Another wave of low chuckles. Grace's fingers curled into the napkin in her lap, gripping it tightly. The cabin lights above hummed softly, the only other sound in the suffocating quiet that followed. Madison sighed dramatically, leaning in just slightly. "It's really sad," she murmured, voice pitched just low enough to sound almost intimate. "Seeing someone your age traveling all alone. No family? No kids?" Grace didn't react, but something in her chest twisted. Madison's smile widened. "I mean, I get it. A lot of people just leave their parents in homes now, right? Maybe that's why you're flying. Going to visit the only ones who'll take you in?" A silence heavier than the last one settled between them. Leah, the younger flight attendant, had paused near the galley, her expression unreadable. She shifted slightly, as if debating stepping in. But then she looked away. Grace let out a slow breath. Her hands remained still in her lap. She wouldn't give Madison the satisfaction of a reaction. "Madison, Sensing the lack of resistance, let out a soft hum. "Well, I hope you have a safe trip, dear. Just remember, if you need anything at all." She reached out and patted Grace's hand, her fingers pressing down just a little too hard. "Don't hesitate to ask. We don't want you feeling helpless, do we?" Then, just like that, she straightened and walked away, her laughter blending into the white noise of the cabin. The sting of Madison's words clung to her, but she refused to let it show. Years of experience had taught her that silence was sometimes the only weapon against people who thrived on humiliation. But Madison wasn't someone who let silence win. The flight had settled into a quiet lull. Passengers scrolled through their phones, some half watching in-flight entertainment. Madison had disappeared to the galley for a while, but Grace knew better than to assume she was done. When Madison returned, she carried a tablet in her hand, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Lancaster," she said, voice edged with fake concern, "there seems to be a little issue with your seat assignment." Grace lifted her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Is that so?" Madison nodded, tapping at the screen. "Yes. I just double-checked, and I wanted to make sure you're actually supposed to be here. It wouldn't be fair to the other passengers if there was a mistake, right?" The words were deliberate. The nearby businessman looked up from his tablet. A young couple across the aisle exchanged glances. A flicker of unease passed over Leah's face, but she said nothing. Grace didn't move. "My ticket is correct," she said evenly. Madison sighed, tilting her head. "I'm sure you believe that. But, memory gets a little fuzzy at a certain age. I'd hate for you to have walked all the way up here when you were actually supposed to be somewhere else." A small ripple of laughter came from a few seats behind her. Grace exhaled slowly, keeping her composure. "Would you like me to show you my boarding pass again?" Madison didn't flinch. "Oh, no need. I already checked." She tapped the tablet once more. "But just to be safe, I think it'd be best if I reconfirmed it with the gate crew. Maybe you should wait at the front until I get that sorted out?" She said it lightly, as if it were a mere suggestion. But the unspoken command was clear. Stand up. Leave the seat. Make room for someone more deserving. Grace's fingers curled against the armrest. For a brief second, she thought about refusing. But the weight of so many eyes, the quiet whispers, the silent agreement of those watching, it was too much. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her cane and pushed herself up. Her body protested. The flight had been long, the subtle ache in her joints now a steady throb. But she wouldn't give Madison the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. She straightened, moving carefully into the aisle. The moment she stood, Madison stepped into her path, blocking her way. Grace looked up, meeting Madison's gaze. Madison smiled, sickly sweet. "Since you're already up, do you need the restroom? I wouldn't want you getting lost trying to find it later." Grace's grip on her cane tightened. "I know where it is." Madison's smile widened. "Are you sure? Because the last thing we need is for you to fall in there. You'd be surprised how slippery those floors can get. And I really don't want to have to land this plane because someone your age took an unfortunate tumble." The words dripped with condescension. Passengers nearby smirked behind their hands. A man up front let out a quiet chuckle. No one objected. No one stopped her. Grace inhaled, measuring her response. "I think I'll manage." Madison nodded. "All right, but if you take too long, I'll have to check in on you. We wouldn't want any accidents." She stepped aside, finally allowing Grace to pass. Grace made her way to the restroom, her movements slow but steady. She could feel Madison's gaze burning into her back the entire way. Even as she entered the lavatory and shut the door, the suffocating weight of it remained. The small lavatory was barely big enough for Grace to turn around, but she braced her hands against the sink, letting the cool surface ground her. Her reflection in the mirror was steady, composed, but the weight in her chest told a different story. She had spent decades facing people like Madison, people who saw weakness where there was none, who mistook silence for submission. But this was different. This was relentless. She took a slow breath before stepping out. The moment she re-entered the cabin, she felt it again. That shift in the air, the way conversations quieted just enough for people to listen without looking directly at her. Madison stood a few feet away, adjusting a tray on the drink cart. But Grace didn't miss the smirk that flickered across her face before she turned away. Grace made her way back to her seat, moving with deliberate patience. She wouldn't rush, wouldn't stumble. Madison had already taken too much. Her dignity wouldn't be next. But just as she lowered herself into her seat, the overhead speakers crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant speaking. We'd like to remind all passengers that first-class seating is reserved for those with valid tickets. If you are unsure about your seat assignment, please check with a crew member to avoid any confusion. The words rang through the cabin, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Grace froze mid-motion, her hands gripping the armrests. Madison didn't look at her. She didn't have to. A few passengers shifted in their seats. A woman across the aisle murmured something to her husband. A businessman up front let out a quiet snort, shaking his head. The implication was clear. Grace finished sitting down, her movements controlled, but her pulse thrummed against her skin. Madison strolled past, pushing the drink cart with practiced ease. She stopped at Grace's row, looking down with mock concern. "Everything all right, dear?" Grace lifted her gaze, calm despite the heat simmering beneath her skin. "Perfectly fine." Madison tilted her head. "You wouldn't happen to have your ID with you, would you? You know, just for verification purposes." A silence, heavier than the last one, settled over the immediate rows. Grace's grip on her cane tightened. "You have my ticket. That should be enough." Madison sighed, clicking her tongue as if disappointed. "It's just a precaution. We have to be thorough, especially when there's a discrepancy." The word hung between them, thick with insinuation. Grace knew what this was. She had already proven she belonged here. This wasn't about protocol. This was about power, about making her prove herself again and again until she gave up and walked away. Passengers nearby watched, but said nothing. Even Leah, standing near the galley, looked down, her fingers curling into a fist at her side. Grace inhaled slowly. She had spent years building her reputation, her legacy. She had stood in boardrooms with men who thought she was too old, too soft, too inexperienced. And yet, she had commanded their respect. But here, on this plane, respect meant nothing. Madison's smile widened, sensing hesitation. "I'll make it easy for you. If you can't provide ID, we'll have to take extra steps. That could mean notifying the captain or even contacting security once we land." A soft ripple of whispers followed. Grace felt it then. The exhaustion, not just from today, but from a lifetime of moments like this. She had fought battles. She had won wars. But here, she was just an old woman with shaking hands and a seat no one thought she deserved. Grace's fingers tightened around the armrests, her mind turning over the situation with careful precision. She had built an empire on patience, on knowing when to strike and when to let arrogance dig its own grave. But the weight of Madison's mockery, the silence of the passengers, the quiet compliance of the crew, it was suffocating. The flight had long settled into a quiet hum, yet the tension in Grace's row was suffocatingly thick. Madison stood there, one hand on her hip, the other still holding the drink cart like a prop in her performance. The demand for an ID still lingered in the air, heavy with expectation. Grace took a slow breath, her voice calm. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Madison blinked, caught off guard for half a second before her smirk returned. She crossed her arms, tilting her head. "Oh, and what mistake is that, dear?" Grace remained composed, thinking that because I'm quiet, I'm weak. The flicker of something uncertain flashed across Madison's face, but she recovered quickly. She let out a short, mocking laugh, tossing a glance toward the nearby passengers, as if inviting them in on the joke. "Oh, I see. You're one of those, huh?" Madison leaned in slightly, voice dropping just enough to sound conspiratorial. "Let me guess. You're going to threaten me now? Maybe call your lawyer? Maybe." She made a dramatic gasp. "Demand to speak to my manager?" A few passengers chuckled under their breath. Madison grinned wider, emboldened. "Please," she scoffed. "I know exactly who you are. You're the type that thinks just because you've lived a long life, the world owes you something. But let me make something clear." She braced both hands on the back of the seat in front of Grace, leaning in close. "You are nothing special. You're just another old woman who refuses to accept that time has passed her by. And no matter how much you want to act like you belong here, everyone on this plane sees the truth. You don't." The words hung in the air like poison, sinking into the fabric of the cabin, into the eyes of every passenger pretending not to listen. Grace's jaw tightened, her grip firm on her cane. Madison leaned back, satisfied. "Now, be a good girl and hand me that ID. Or should I call security so they can escort you out properly?" The moment stretched too long, too uncomfortable. Even Leah, who had remained silent all this time, looked away, her knuckles white against the cart handle. Grace's voice was measured, controlled. "I suggest you walk away while you still can." Madison's smirk widened, mistaking the statement for desperation. She tapped her fingers against the seat, pretending to consider it. No, I think I'll stay." She straightened, folding her arms again. "You see, Mrs. Lancaster, people like you think you can intimidate people like me just because you've been around longer. But you're wrong." She took a slow step back. "You're old, you're slow, and most of all, you're alone." Silence. Madison waited for Grace to break. For the first time, the entire cabin felt the stillness. Then Grace smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't forced, just a small, knowing expression that sent a chill through the air. Madison's smile faltered just for a second. Grace adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, slow, deliberate. Then she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to regret this." The words were soft, but they carried weight. A weight that made Madison hesitate, her fingers curling slightly. Something shifted. Madison scoffed, shaking it off. "Oh, please," she muttered, rolling her eyes. "Just sit tight, Grandma. You'll be gone soon enough." She turned on her heel and walked away, still playing to her silent audience. But the laughter was quieter now. The whispers less amused. Something had changed, and deep down, Madison felt it. Madison strutted down the aisle, radiating smug satisfaction. The quiet tension in the air only fed her sense of control. She had made her point, humiliated the old woman beyond repair, and now all that was left was waiting for the inevitable. Security dragging Grace out like a helpless, confused relic of the past. She relished the thought. The silence of the passengers, their quiet compliance, was proof that she had won. No one would stand up for Grace, and Grace herself was too weak, too insignificant to fight back. Madison could already imagine how the rest of this flight would go. By the time they landed, Grace would be nothing more than a forgotten inconvenience, a cautionary tale for anyone else who dared to think they belonged somewhere they didn't. But just as she turned toward the galley, a voice rang out, smooth, authoritative, and carrying the kind of weight that made even the most confident people pause. "Stop, right now." It wasn't shouted, but the effect was immediate. The entire cabin fell silent. Every head turned. Even Madison froze mid-step, the fake smile still plastered on her lips, but something in her eyes flickered. An instinctive fear she didn't yet understand. The voice belonged to Logan Lancaster, seated in the private VIP section just beyond first class. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, he exuded the quiet authority of a man accustomed to power. The moment he stood, passengers began murmuring, realizing who he was. The realization hit Madison like a slap, but she refused to falter. She turned, trying to keep her posture straight, her professional mask slipping just slightly. "Sir," she said smoothly, though there was the faintest tremor in her voice. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Logan's expression was unreadable as he stepped forward, his sharp blue eyes locking onto her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "I assume you finished making a fool of yourself," he said flatly. Madison's smile twitched, but she forced it to remain. "Sir, I was just ensuring that our seating policy is upheld." This passenger," Logan cut in, is my grandmother." The weight of the revelation crashed through the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers who had smirked moments ago now looked stunned. A few people gasped. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Madison's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Leah, the younger flight attendant, took an instinctive step back, her expression a mixture of shock and horror. Grace, still seated, watched the scene unfold without a word. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no smugness, just the quiet certainty of a woman who had seen this moment coming long before anyone else. Logan didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Tell me, Miss Clark," he said, tilting his head slightly. "What exactly did you say to my grandmother? That she didn't belong here? That she was just another old woman?" Madison's lungs squeezed tight. Her carefully built composure fractured, her hands clenching into small fists. "Sir, I didn't know." "No," Logan said coolly. "You didn't. And yet, that didn't stop you, did it?" The silence stretched. Madison tried to recover, straightening her shoulders. "It was a misunderstanding," she said quickly, voice higher than before. I was just following protocol." Logan's eyes darkened, his tone razor sharp. "Really? Because I don't recall humiliating the airline's founder being part of the protocol." Passengers stared. Some exchanged looks. A man in business class shook his head in disgust. Madison desperately searched for a lifeline, but none came. No one defended her. No one laughed along with her anymore. Madison felt the blood drain from her face, her confidence slipping through her fingers like sand. She had built an entire career on controlling situations, on asserting dominance where she could. But now, standing beneath the weight of Logan Lancaster's gaze, she felt small for the first time in her life. The murmurs in the cabin had changed. No longer quiet amusement or passive indifference. Now, the passengers were engaged, alert, watching her the way people watch a crash they can't look away from. The realization twisted in her stomach. They weren't on her side anymore. They never had been. Logan's voice cut through the silence, calm but absolute. "You're done." 2 words. Nothing more, nothing less. But they carried the force of a hammer dropping on steel. Madison's throat tightened. "Sir, please." Logan's expression didn't change. "You don't work here anymore." The weight of those words crashed into her like a physical blow. The air in her lungs vanished. She had spent years clawing her way up, ensuring her dominance over the cabin, making herself untouchable among the flight crew. And yet, in a matter of seconds, it was all being stripped away. She felt the stares. The way passengers no longer looked at her with respect, but with something closer to disgust. The businessman in 2C scoffed, shaking his head. A woman in 3A leaned toward her husband, muttering something under her breath that made him smirk. The humiliation burned. And then, the final dagger. A deep chuckle from a passenger toward the middle of the cabin, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Wow," he said, shaking his head. "She spent the whole flight treating that woman like dirt, and now look at her. Karma's fast today." Soft, quiet laughter rippled through the rows. Madison's breath hitched. The warmth in her face wasn't just from anger now, it was shame. Her fingers trembled against the fabric of her uniform. She turned, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Leah, the younger flight attendant, wouldn't meet her eyes. The pilots hadn't stepped in. And Grace still hadn't spoken. She just sat there, watching. And somehow, that was worse than any of it. Because Grace had won without saying a single word. The noise in the cabin grew, whispers turning into full conversations. Madison was no longer the one in control. She was the spectacle now, the one being judged, picked apart, laughed at. She wanted to say something, to claw back even a shred of dignity, but there was nothing left. Nothing she could say that wouldn't sound like a desperate plea. Logan took a slow step closer, his voice lowering just enough that only she could hear. "Get off my plane." Madison's entire world had shattered in minutes. The once powerful flight attendant, who had ruled the cabin with an iron fist, now stood at the edge of her own destruction. Every passenger had seen it. Every whisper, every smirk, every quiet shake of the head was another crack in the pedestal she had built for herself. She had thought she was untouchable, that she could treat people however she pleased, and the world would bend to her rules. But the world had just snapped back. Her feet felt heavy as she turned, each step toward the exit weighing on her like a stone dragging her down. She had been so sure of herself, so sure that Grace Lancaster was just another helpless old woman, another easy target. And yet, Grace had never even needed to fight back. She had let Madison destroy herself. The humiliation was unbearable, but what truly burned was the realization that she had done this to herself. No one had set a trap. No one had schemed against her. She had built her own downfall, one cruel comment at a time. And then, just as she reached the aisle, just as she thought she could disappear, Grace finally spoke. "Miss Clark." The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. The voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't angry. It was calm, steady, and powerful in a way that no shouting could ever be. Madison stopped mid-step, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned, hands clenching at her sides, expecting a final insult, a cutting remark, something to finish breaking her completely. But instead, Grace simply looked at her, eyes filled with something Madison couldn't comprehend. Not pity, not triumph, something else. "The most important lesson in life," Grace said softly, "is not how to rise, but how to stand after you've fallen." The words hit harder than any punishment ever could. Madison's throat tightened. She had spent her whole life climbing, stepping over others, proving she was better, stronger, untouchable. And now she had fallen further than she ever thought possible. A painful silence stretched between them. Then Logan's voice cut through it like steel. "So tell me, Madison," he said, folding his arms, eyes unreadable. "Are you going to walk away like a failure? Or are you going to learn something from today?" The weight of the choice hung over her. Madison's fingers curled, her breath shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to hold on to what little dignity she had left. But then she looked at Grace, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see weakness. She saw strength. Strength that didn't come from power, but from knowing who you were, even when the world tried to tear you down. For the first time in her life, Madison didn't know what to do. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to learn. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this. What was the most shocking moment for you? Did Madison deserve a second chance, or was her downfall justified? Let us know in the comments. Also, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you.